Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another lecture in the Viking television series, this time during Space Week. I'm going to be talking to you about the planet Mars, particularly about exploring the red planet. Mars has been very much in the news in the last few weeks, or especially in the last 12 months, actually, because there's been all sorts of things going on, and there still is. It really is the most exciting time to be looking at the planet Mars. And what I'm going to try and show you in this lecture is a view of how we know what we know about Mars and where exactly we're going to with all the probes and all the activity that's taking place on the red planet. Starting off, we all know that Mars is the fourth planet out from the Sun. And this slide here shows the size of the four planets, in particular the four what we call the terrestrial planets. We've got the innermost Mercury, then you've got Venus and the Earth, both roughly the same size. And then, of course, we've got Mars, which is roughly half the size of the Earth. And Mars is about 219 million kilometers from the Sun, whereas we're 150 million kilometers from the Sun. So it makes a huge difference to the surface conditions on Mars and has given rise to all sorts of theories and speculations about what the Martian surface and indeed the potential for life on the surface of Mars may well be, which is what we're going to talk about. Just a quick bit of facts for you. The Martian day is roughly the same length as our day, just a fraction over 24 hours. And of course, so I've changed that slide too quickly. The Martian year is 686 Earth days, or sols, we call them. The word that we use is sol. So that's Mars for us. And Mars, like the Earth, does have seasons. It has distinct seasons on Mars, just like we do, except their seasons are 3 months in duration, six months in duration, sorry. They're 6 months compared to our 3 months. And Mars, as I've mentioned earlier, orbits at roughly the same time as the Earth orbits on its axis as well. Mars has got a very thin atmosphere comprising of CO2, roughly a percentage, about 1% less that of the Earth, and the Martian temperature can go from all the way from minus 153 to 20 degrees Celsius, but the average temperature on Mars is about 60 degrees minus. Now, Mars has got two moons. They're very small moons. Compared to our own moon on the Earth, the two Martian moons are very tiny indeed, discovered back in 1867, and we think they formed at roughly the same time that Mars was formed. The two of them, Phobos 22 kilometers and Deimos 12 kilometers in diameter, are actually a target for sending a Russian spacecraft in the next few years, because getting onto the surface of Phobos and bringing back a sample of the material on Phobos is far more practical than it is to try and get to Mars, because getting to Mars is a much bigger body. Therefore, the gravitational attraction, etc., is such that getting to Phobos would be a very favorable thing to do. Sadly, the Russians have tried to do that on a number of occasions without success, but I understand they're planning to do another mission to Phobos in around 2026. Now, when we look at Mars, and at the moment Mars is visible in our morning sky, Mars goes through a series of what we call, its orbit, and it comes to what we call opposition, when it's exactly opposite the Sun. If you look at the top of my screen, you can see the date there, 2022. I don't know if you can see that, but 2022, Mars is exactly opposite the Sun, and that's where the word opposition comes from. Mars comes to opposition every 25.5 months, not just over 2 years, and the distance varies depending on the place Mars is on its orbit around the Sun. Because like all the planets in the solar system, they orbit in ellipses, not perfect circles. As a consequence, top left-hand side of my screen there, you can see the apparent size of Mars in 2018 compared to 2025. And in 2003, we had an extremely close Martian opposition, and Mars was much bigger than it normally is, and it was really quite dramatic to see in the night sky. If you want to see Mars for yourself at the moment, at the time we're delivering this lecture, Mars is just appeared in the morning sky, arriving in the morning sky before sunrise, and can be seen quite clearly. Incidentally, there's another planet very close to Mars at the moment, and that's the planet Venus, which has just re-emerged into the morning sky as well. Now, if you want to communicate with people on Mars, you have to bear in mind that the distance between Mars and the Earth varies considerably depending where both planets are in their orbit. It can vary from 54 million miles to 401 million kilometers. Sorry, I said miles, I meant kilometers. And that difference makes a difference of 3 minutes to 22 minutes in times of communication. And that is going to be a huge problem when we send a human presence to Mars, because we won't be able to have instant communication because the ability to do so just doesn't exist because of light speed and the fact that Mars will be so far away at certain parts of its orbit. Now then, the telescope was not invented or used for astronomy for the very first time until a chap called Lippershey discovered it, or invented one, and Galileo then turned the telescope to heavens for the very first time. And this was in 1610. Christian Huygens, who's a very famous Dutch astronomer, he actually is recorded as being the first person to draw images of Mars when it was at opposition in 1659. And we can see quite clearly on that drawing on the right-hand side there that there is some clear features on the surface of the red planet. They weren't very distinct because the instruments weren't that good. About 200 years later, an Italian astronomer by the name of Schiaparelli, he made a very detailed drawing and map of the planet Mars, and in doing so, he actually linked the structures or the surface features of Mars together with long lines. And he called these long dark streets canali, which is the Italian word for channels, which is what he thought they were. And although that does not expressly say there's life on Mars, the Western press translated the word canali to canals, and the idea of Martians on Mars was born. And that's where we think it came from. This fascination with the idea that maybe life could exist on another planet in our solar system has been the dream and subject of science fiction for many, many years. And now the dream is becoming reality as we're actually sending spacecraft to Mars at comparatively regular intervals. The plot thickened when in 1900, a famous astronomer by the name of Percival Lowell, working at the Flagstaff, Arizona Observatory, he actually claimed not only to be able to see the canals on Mars, but he was also able to describe the physiological, social, and the political traits of the Martians, as is explained in this very short video.
I see a vast network of channels crisscrossing the planet. Obviously the work of intelligent Martians. The simplicity and symmetry cannot...
It will be possible with larger telescopes to see cities on Mars, to detect navies in its harbors.
The inhabitants of Mars are vast, cool, and unsympathetic intellects, looking across space at the planet Earth with envious eyes. Are they planning an invasion?
One of the things that gave rise to this belief that there was something going on Mars in the means of some form of artificial life or some life on the planet was the fact that we get distinct seasonal changes on the surface. And these, what became known as waves of darkening, it was indicative that maybe something was moving on the surface from pole to the equator and back again. And it was suggested that this possibly could have been vegetation growing alongside the Martian canals. If you've ever seen a photograph of the Earth from space, you can see the Nile Valley, the verdant green of the Nile Valley, where the water is used for irrigation purposes, against the Sahara Desert. It was the same speculation on Mars, that something was moving this material, or something was moving on the Mars canals. So this helped to fuel the idea of the resident Martians. And of course, when we look back in history, when we look back in the throughout the media, H.G. Wells published a very well-known book in 1897, and there's been various TV variations of this since. And his book, War of the Worlds, talks about a Martian invasion. We didn't have social media like we have today back in the 1930s, just under 100 years ago. But the radio was the biggest form of entertainment people had in the 1930s. Indeed, about 8 million radios were sold in the United States alone in 1936. And then along came a gentleman called Orson Welles, no relation, slight difference in the spelling, and he made a live broadcast of the book, The War of the Worlds.
No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this Earth with envious eyes. And slowly and surely, they drew their plans against us.
The space age began, of course, in 1957, and the first spacecraft was sent to Mars. Actually, well, it wasn't sent to Mars. The first attempt to getting to Mars was in 1960 by the Russians, and the spacecraft didn't get out of Earth orbit. But eventually, the Americans were successful in 1964 when the Mariner 4 spacecraft went past Mars on a flyby mission and gave us back 22 pictures of what we saw of Mars on the 15th of July 1964. These images completely changed our views about the red planet. It was a heavily cratered, dusty, barren place, no evidence of water, civilization, canals, or anything. And there was a lot of disappointment by the media, but it was not unexpected by the scientists, because Mars, being so far out from the sun, is very much likely to be a dead, desolate world. We since have believed that Mars has changed over the centuries, or the millennia, effectively, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. The Mariner 9 spacecraft in 1971 was launched, and this one, rather than being a flyby mission, actually was put into Martian orbit. And when it entered Martian orbit, it sent back some wonderful pictures. It sent back pictures of the biggest volcano in the solar system, Olympus Mons. It sent back pictures of various gullies, collapsed terrain thought to be caused by thawing underground ice, which makes them collapse, and of course, lots of erosional features. So it was obvious that Mars suffers erosion just like we do, and there was evidence of surface water having flown on Mars sometime in the long distant past. So we carried on looking at Mars, we carried on wanting to know what else we could find out, and in 1976 the Americans launched 2 spacecraft to Mars, the 2 Viking spacecraft, Viking 1 and Viking 2. They were a bicentennial project, both meant to land on and around Independence Day, which would be the 200th anniversary of the United States. They were unable to land on that date due to dust storms taking place on Mars, but they were both 100% successful. They both went into orbit, and they both deployed the landers. And they sent back some stunning photographs of Mars. Here we've got the pictures from Viking 1, taken on the 20th of July 1976. That big rock in the foreground was given the affectionate name of Big Joe, and the Viking 2 spacecraft that landed a few months later. This is a picture from it, or 2 pictures from it, and you can see the robotic arm that came off one of the sampling devices on the spacecraft sitting on the Martian surface. And again, these pictures, although they were spectacular, they did give rise to the belief that there's no life potentially on the Martian surface. There was one thing we didn't realize at the time, and both spacecraft took with them various types of experiments they could use. They could dig the Martian surface and expose the Martian surface to instruments on board the spacecraft. And one thing they did find was a lot of oxygen in the Martian soil. This was not expected, but now when we look back on it, we realize that the incoming infrared radiation penetrates down to the Martian surface and completely sterilizes the surface. And as a consequence, you get oxides and all sorts of compounds forming, peroxides, I should say, not oxides, and these compounds basically sterilize the surface. So to an extent, we lost interest to a degree. But then around 15 to 20 years later, this object was found in deepest Antarctica. And this object was found, go back to our Viking missions for a moment, the onboard experiments were able to tell us what Martian rocks were made of. They were able to determine the composition of the rocks in comparison to the rocks on the Earth. And this meteorite, which was found in Antarctica, had lain there and undiscovered for many, many years, was found in 1984. And when it was finally cut open, they realized inside it was something that couldn't possibly have been fossilized bacteria. And this really motivated the scientists to once again believe that, okay, life may not exist on Mars at the moment, but maybe it did in the long distant past. And part of our quest on the Earth, one of the reasons we go to Mars, and indeed a lot of the other scientific experiments we do in the solar system, is to detect whether life exists anywhere else other than on the Earth. That is one of the big goals, the big quests that the astronomers and the scientists have been asking for many, many years, and will continue to do so. But the idea that this tiny, tiny bit of bacteria could have been on Mars and originated on Mars gave rise to the idea that maybe life existed on Mars in the ancient geological past. We now actually believe that bit of fossil, if you go back a fraction, that little bit of fossil there is actually a contamination from the Earth that gave rise to it. There's two theories. One is it's contamination from Earth. The other is it's formed by geological means. And a lot of the processes we see and discuss about life on Mars can be caused by geological means, not necessarily biological means. And that's one of the big questions we've got on Mars. So following the results from the earlier missions and following the exploration or the discovery of this material in the meteorite from Antarctica, the Americans launched a new Mars exploration program. They consolidated everything they've known about since, and they launched what they called the Mars exploration program. And this program has three distinct paradigms. And basically, what they want to do is, firstly, follow the evidence of water and see where it leads to. Secondly, explore these areas and see if there's any potential for habitability to take place at those areas. In other words, is the surface conditions such that life could have evolved? And then the third paradigm was to actually go to Mars and seek for signs of ancient life. We're not looking for little green men. That's the stuff of science fiction. We're looking for evidence of fossilized life, of ancient bacteria, or something that may have started to form life, if you like, on the Martian surface before the conditions changed and Mars became the desolate place we know today. But these three distinct paradigms lead ultimately to preparing for the human exploration of Mars. And this is a very exciting time, as I mentioned at the beginning, because this is the point we're at now. The latest probe to Mars is seeking signs of life, and we are talking seriously about the possibility of sending men and women to Mars sometime in the next 15 to 20 years. The first one of these programs, the first mission that was to take place after the establishment of the MEP program, was in 1997, when they launched to Mars the spacecraft Sojourner and the Mars Pathfinder mission. And the Mars Pathfinder mission was a technology proving event, landed on July the 4th, American Independence Day once again, and it took a little tiny rover with it. And this little tiny rover on the surface of Mars was an outstanding success. It actually worked perfectly and proved that the technology used to get onto the Martian surface did in fact work, and worked extremely well. It was deployed from the landing site of the Pathfinder probe, and Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, everyone's favorite astronomer, who cannot remember his wonderful book Cosmos, he had died sadly when the spacecraft was on the way to Mars. So they called the landing site the Sagan Memorial Station, and the little rover was deployed from there, and it wandered around the Martian surface some distance, not too very far away, but it certainly was able to rove around and look at different bits of rock and material on the Martian surface. It really was a great success. There was, however, one great surprise.
Vigy balra 20 fokkal.
We always want to know why they're green, but they always are in the comics and the film strips and everything else. Carrying on with our paradigm of following the water, the European Space Agency launched and got their spacecraft, the Mars Express, into Martian territory. It was launched in 2003. It carried a small lander called Beagle, a British spacecraft that was released from the orbiting spacecraft. Sadly, we didn't hear from Beagle again. The Mars Express spacecraft went into orbit on Christmas Day 2003, and Beagle, sadly, we think it landed okay, but one of the hinged lids on board the spacecraft didn't deploy properly, so they're unable to communicate with it, which was a huge shame because it was an exciting mission. Mars Express continues to work to this day, and in 2018 took this wonderful image of a crater named Korolev, after the Russian rocket scientist. It's 50 miles in diameter, and it's comprising basically of CO2 and possibly frozen water beneath the CO2. So the more we look, the more things we find, the more things we want to find out about on our next mission. And this was followed in 2003 by the United States twin missions of Spirit and Opportunity. And these two rovers, landing in the same way that the Pathfinder spacecraft landed, both launched in 2003 and both successfully reached Mars and landed. both probes were outstanding successes. They really were. They were both meant to last for approximately 3 months, 3 Martian months, or 90 Martian sols on the surface. Spirit actually kept going for about 7 years before eventually it got in a position where it couldn't get out of some soft soil and it couldn't recharge its batteries using its solar panels, and it died. The other one, Opportunity, kept going right through until 2018 and then was lost following a dust storm on Mars when the solar panels were blocked with the Martian dust and there wasn't sufficient power generated to get the spacecraft going again. Fantastic success when you consider they were meant to last for 3 months. One lasted for 10 years and the other one lasted for about 18 years, whatever it was. And when you think about it, I don't think many people watching have got a car that they've got that's that old. You may well have a classic car, but I bet you've been servicing it and putting things in it. These two little spacecraft, or these two rovers on Mars, have been untouched by human hands since they were launched back in 2003. Amazing bit of engineering, and all credit to the engineers and the scientists who developed them. The next spacecraft to go to Mars was the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which was launched in 2005 and arrived in Mars in March 2006. But this spacecraft got into orbit using a new method. It's called what we call aerobraking. And the aerobraking means that the spacecraft can carry more scientific packages and instruments on board and not have to have the weight of an engine and fuel, which you normally would need to get to have what we call orbital insertion. Well, this spacecraft is still now operating very well indeed and has got a camera on it that's able to take a resolution down to 20 to 30 centimeters from its operating height of 300 kilometers. This is one of its famous pictures, Victoria Crater, 800 kilometers in diameter. And at the top left of this picture, you can't see it, of course, is the site of where the Opportunity rover was actually working. Amazing picture showing the surface features of Mars with such great resolution from the MRO in orbit around the surface. And in 2018, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter actually discovered evidence of glaciers in the mid-latitudes rather than just to the northern hemisphere. Now, only a few days ago, that suggestion of buried glaciers under the surface of Mars has been put into doubt because a recent report, literally published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, is now saying that the seismic images they're getting from this rock or this material could well be volcanic rock rather than ice. So it's a big debate going on at the moment as to whether there is ice under the surface, but as we'll see in a moment, there most certainly is water ice in small quantities just underneath the Martian surface. Because in 2007, they launched the Phoenix Polar Lander. The previous spacecraft was meant to land in one of the polar regions of Mars a few years earlier and failed. We believe it may have landed in a canyon and the signal couldn't get out from the walls of the canyon. But the Mars Phoenix lander launched in 2007, reached Mars in May 2008, and this was the scene that greeted the scientists when they came to work one morning when the images had been downloaded. The white material there is ice. And when they saw this, one of the scientists, who was a fellow VRA, I won't embarrass him by naming him, but a fellow VRA who was on the ships occasionally, he saw this and he explained holy, and he didn't use the word cow, I'll leave that to your imagination. And so the landing site of this particular spacecraft has been known as Holy Cow ever since. Upon further investigation by digging trenches in the surface of Mars using the material, the equipment on board, after 20 days after landing, they were able to show this little trench here, and you can see those lumps of white material inside the trench. These are ice cubes reported to be used by the Martians in their gin and tonics. Honestly, believe that, you believe everything. But these nuggets of ice, if you like, what we call that happens to them is they sublimate. They literally go from a solid, to a gas almost instantaneously. And 4 Martian days later, you can see quite clearly that they have disappeared. Where have they gone? The only explanation is they were water ice. So we are confident there is water ice in some quantity on the Martian surface. Whether it's sufficient quantity for us to mine it and to use it for fuel, etc., is something we've yet to find out. But this was a great discovery by the Phoenix lander back in 2007. Going back to the Mars exploration program, following the great success of the missions we've just mentioned, the Reconnaissance Orbiter, the European Space Agency and the Phoenix lander, the next stage of exploring Mars was to commence.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Main engine start, 0, and liftoff of the Atlas V with Curiosity, seeking clues to the planetary puzzle about life on Mars.
The program is in right on time. 180 operating % plus as expected. And throttling down to 76%.
And that was the landing of Curiosity. The moment that was most critical, you may recall from that video, was when the sky crane actually dropped the rover onto the surface. And at that point, as the rover's wheels hit the Martian surface or landed softly on the Martian surface, the cables were cut and the sky crane flew off and landed in nearby Martian terrain. The big fear was that the cables would not cut correctly and they would just drag the rover across the surface and smash it into thousands of pieces. It did work successfully, and the Curiosity rover is still working to this day highly successfully and has sent us back some wonderful results. Well, amongst the results it sent us is clear evidence of sedimentation. Here you're looking at a delta, a riverbed, and you're looking at rocks that are clearly layered, which is clearly there. These are mudstones, I understand, and these mudstones are clearly indicative of the fact that there would have been water flowing on the Martian surface in the long distant past. So the goal, the paradigm of finding the habitability zones, this is the sort of area that life may well have existed in the ancient past on the Martian surface. And this picture, taken only a few weeks ago in November 2021, is one of the best pictures we've seen from Curiosity. It's actually a composite of two separate images, and the rover has been climbing up this mountain, a 5-kilometer mountain, since it landed, and sent us back this picture in November. And it just shows something of the expertise and the engineering that went into launching this amazing spacecraft and sending it to the red planet. That brings us to the latest missions. The latest missions now are the third of our paradigms, which is seeking for signs of life. And that's what this next spacecraft is going to do, the next American spacecraft, Perseverance. But before that, there were two other nations decided to send spacecraft to Mars in 2021. The United Arab Emirates launched their spacecraft Hope to Mars.
メインエンジンスタート。今メインエンジンの西。SRB 点火。SRB シナリオレフト。H2A ロケット42号機は2020年1月20日午前6時56分14秒に種子島宇宙センターから打ち上げられました。
And that one successfully orbited on July 19th was then followed a few days later by the Chinese spacecraft Tianwen-1. And finally,
and liftoff. As the countdown to Mars continues, the perseverance of humanity launching the next generation of robotic explorers to the Red Planet.
And Atlas TU has gone to closed-loop control.
all three spacecraft launched successfully, as I say, in July of last year. And last year, 2020, they arrived at Mars in February 2021. The United Arab spacecraft and the Chinese spacecraft went into orbit respectively on the 9th and 10th of February, whereas the Perseverance and Tianwen-1 both landed on February 18th and on May the 30th. And it's interesting to note the subtle differences in the reaction from the various mission control people on arrival.
Relief in Dubai's mission control that after a journey of 300 million miles, their spacecraft had successfully slammed on the brakes and gone into orbit around Mars.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the sands of past life.
As you can see, major cultural differences. But this time, the landing system was very similar to that of the Curiosity rover. In fact, it was identical. But they had cameras on it. And there's a series of videos now I'm just going to play for you quickly. One shows the spacecraft Perseverance landing on the surface. The second shows the sky crane looking up from Perseverance. And the third one actually shows the sky crane after the cables have broken or been severed, it flying away into the distance.
About to conduct the sky crane maneuver. Sky crane maneuver has started. About 20 meters off the surface.
We're getting signals from...
Sky crane maneuver has started. About 20 meters off the surface. Touchdown confirmed.
And that last video there you saw was actually the ascent of the sky crane going up into the sky, and you can see the cables dangling down beneath it as it had deposited the rover on the surface and the sky crane flew away. And actually one of the first things Perseverance did when it landed on the surface was detect the impact of the landing sky crane on a distant hill not too far away. Amazing bit of engineering, 100% successful, and of course it was able to carry on roving around Mars, which it's doing to this day. But as well as landing on the surface of Mars, they also took with them a small flying machine. Again, this is what we call a technology prover, and this little tiny helicopter, if you like, was carried on the underbelly of the Perseverance rover. It was deployed, and the rover dropped it onto the surface, it unfolded itself, and it started to deploy itself. It was carried, as I say, to Mars on the rover. To fly anything in the Martian atmosphere, you've got to have two rotors rotating counterclockwise to each other at about 2,500 revs per minute. Eventually, they got everything ready, and eventually they were ready to try and see if the rover would fly. It was meant to fly on a test mission. They hoped to fly it 4 times. It landed with the rover on the 18th of February, and it was deployed for the first time on the 3rd of April, and its first flight took place on April the 19th. Having successfully taken off, it took off a total of 4 times. They then managed to fly it a load of other times as well. And at the last count, it had flown 19 times. They still hope to fly it even more times, and it has been another outstanding success. The idea is that future rovers will carry bigger helicopters, bigger flying machines, and they will be able to scout out the terrain to tell the rover where to go to look for the most important samples and things it needs to recover or take samples of. Amazing, again, bit of engineering. Perseverance has now started its core mission, which is collecting samples. It has got 25 core tubes on board, and it's basically going to put rock into these. It's going to take these samples at various locations, and then it's going to cache them on the surface of Mars, where they can be collected by another rover, we anticipate, in about 10 years' time. It's not quite on the drawing board 100%, but the plan is there for a European and NASA combined spacecraft, which will go and collect the core samples and bring them back to the Earth, we think, in around 2033. If you're interested, if you imagine a cigar tube, a cigar tube is the best example of the core samples, the size of the core samples that they're taking. They're sealing them on board, and then they will be deposited on the surface for them to be collected. And only a few days ago, following one of the collections of one of the samples just before Christmas, they had some rock caught up inside the rock drill, and they took the rover up onto a little bit of a hill and literally waggled one of its wheels, and in doing so it dislodged the sample of the bit of rock that was in the way and cleared the way for them to take further samples. Something again that was not anticipated when they launched the mission or when they designed the instrumentation for it, but due to the ingenuity of the scientists at NASA, JPL, etc., they were able to fix the spacecraft remotely all those millions of miles away. As I said there, the first 5 samples were collected successfully in 2021. In the meantime, there are great plans for other missions to go to Mars. The Europeans and the Russians are planning another rover to go to Mars at the end of this year, launching in autumn 22, will arrive at Mars in summer 23. It'll deploy the Rosalind Franklin rover. Rosalind Franklin, the rover was named after her. She was a pioneer in DNA research. But as well as the Europeans and the Russians, the Indians are planning a probe in 2024, and the Chinese are also planning another mission to Mars in the not too distant future, probably around 2024, 2026. Launch windows to Mars open every 2 years. They coincide with the oppositions, and therefore you can get to Mars roughly every 2 years. There are also plans for SpaceX to send something to Mars, but that is very much on the drawing board, and we have no details at this stage of any firm plans by SpaceX. So, where's all this going to lead to? Well, there's been a whole host of different ideas and suggestions of how we can get to Mars. Back in 2010, Barack Obama, the President of the United States, predicted a crewed Mars mission could orbit Mars by the mid-2030s, and that is certainly still on the drawing board as far as NASA are concerned. In 2015, Buzz Aldrin launched his Mars colony concept with the Florida Institute of Technology, and Buzz's idea is basically in his book here, Mission to Mars, but he came up with what he calls a Mars cycler. The yellow line on that diagram there shows a spacecraft in orbit between the green orbit of the Earth and the red of Mars, and the spacecraft will constantly orbit between the two. And if you had a series of these sort of missions or cyclers, you could have regular bus service, if you like, to the red planet. It is technically feasible. And Buzz made a lovely quote, which I'll give you now. Buzz said that the Pilgrim Fathers came here to stay and live. They didn't wait round Pilgrim Rock for the return trips, and neither will people building up a population and a settlement on Mars. That was 2015. Since then, NASA have gone ahead with their Artemis project, the return to the moon and on to Mars. This year, later this year, probably about March, April time, they're going to be launching the first unmanned mission, Artemis mission, to the moon. And that is the first of many missions to take men and women back to the moon and hopefully on to Mars. In 2015, the NASA administrator reaffirmed the NASA's goal of sending humans to Mars in the 2030s, and the idea is to build a fully equipped underground colony. As well as this, we've got Elon Musk, the private enterprise, now looking at the idea of sending spacecraft to Mars, and Elon Musk came up with his SpaceX plans about 2016. His mission and his whole ethos of exploring space and going to Mars is a story in its own right, but he's got a brand new spaceship called Starship, and this Starship, made of stainless steel, could carry up to 100 colonists to Mars. He launched a test flight, the one you see on your screen now. That was launched in 2019, and a little bit earlier than that, he was actually quoted as saying that maybe you could get to Mars for a little bit less than $500,000. And we are hoping that an orbital test of a Starship will take place in the next few months. I understand the Federal Aviation Authority are looking into the launch plans, and their report is due out at the end of February, after which we could have a test flight of Starship, an orbital test, shortly thereafter. In the meantime, he elaborates further. A year later, he elaborated further with his Mars colony plans. Here you see two SpaceX starships on the Martian surface, and the idea is that they will land, form a small colony, which will, over a period of years, be expanded until we have a town/colony on Mars. Underground, overground, the distinction is not important at this stage, but the idea is that we will go to Mars and stay there. That is the goal of Elon Musk and SpaceX. NASA reaffirmed their decision to go to Mars and hopefully get there by 2037. You may recall they plan to get back to the moon by 2025. That has now been put back just 12 months, but the whole concept, the whole idea, the hardware is being tested. And as I say, there is a mission planned for later this year, which will launch the first of the Artemis spacecraft using the new SLS launch system. This is the new SLS launch system. Will be launched from Cape Kennedy and will be carrying the Orion spacecraft. The Orion spacecraft, which is the new manned spacecraft that the US government are funding for NASA. And this spacecraft, similar in not size, but certainly shape to the old Apollo spacecraft, will carry up to 4 astronauts into deep space to the moon and beyond, and hopefully on to Mars. Eventually, after establishing a lunar base, NASA will then go the next step and send astronauts initially into orbit around Mars, and then hopefully to land on Mars and start the work of establishing a base there. Initially, of course, it'll be there and back, but then they hopefully will go there and start establishing a Martian colony. In the meantime, China in 2019 announced that they plan to go to Mars in the mid-2030s. A year later, Russia said the same, but this time the late 2030s. And of course, Elon Musk has now only recently expressed great confidence on the idea of sending a crewed mission to Mars by 2026. I suspect, I may be wrong, but I suspect you may well see a SpaceX vehicle on the way to Mars before the end of this year, or certainly next year. It'll be unmanned initially, but once he's got his orbital spacecraft technique working, I think his next step will be go to Mars. And this is the first test of a Starship SN15. This one was the first successful test because SpaceX, not frightened of failure. If the rocket doesn't work, they then plan another one until they get it right. And this was the first launch of one of the Starships that was launched successfully just up to about 100 kilometers in height. And then it landed, as you'll see on the video, successfully on its own legs. And there you had it, the first successful mission. Since then, the next step, as I say, is to go into orbit, which will hopefully be in the next few months. In the meantime, they're busy building the other vehicle, and this is actually the world's largest space vehicle ever assembled. The black bit at the top there is the Starship 15, which is the one that they wanted to, they showed you a moment ago, and this is the booster that will send it to orbit. Incidentally, the bottom half of that booster, the silver bit, that is planned to come back. That's the big change with SpaceX. They bring back as much of the hardware as they can and reuse it again and again. And that is cutting the cost and enabling them to develop at a far greater rate than perhaps we did initially back in the 60s. In August 2021, here we go, they stacked that vehicle at their base in Texas. The world's largest rocket, bigger than the Saturn V by about 30 feet. So we'll wait and see. So maybe, could this be Mars sometime in the not too distant future? So when we consider the red planet, it's incredible what we've managed to achieve in the last 40, 50 years. And now we have had so many successful missions to Mars. It's incredible what we're able to do. And I hope you've enjoyed our look at the red planet. It's significant that one of the new Viking ships that's coming on stream later this year, the Viking Mars, will bear the name Viking Mars. And Mars has been a place of great fascination for us for many, many years. So I hope to see you on board sometime in the not too distant future, either myself or one of the other Viking resident astronomers, and we can tell you and update you about what's going on the red planet. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Good night.